Let us discuss one of the most misunderstood luxury cars in automotive history, and that is the 1959 Continental Mark IV. And yes, I said Continental Mark IV because 1959 was the last year of the Continental division from Ford Motor Company, which had started in 1956 when the Mark II was launched. Obviously, the Continental Mark II was really a beautiful vehicle, but frankly not a sales success, in part because of its price. And these 1958 and 59 Lincoln, in particular the latter one is what I'm featuring here, really were not sales successes either. And so as a result, Ford decided to fold the Continental division back into Lincoln, and for 1960, the car would be known as the Lincoln Continental Mark V. But these Mark III, 4, and 5, produced from 1958 to 1960, represent some of the most misunderstood and strange Lincolns that were ever produced, if I can call them Lincolns, since, as I mentioned, the Continental division was dropped partway through the production of these automobiles. In fact, it was so misunderstood that when Ford launched the Mark III in 1969, they called it just that, forgetting about the Mark III, 4, and 5 that were produced from 1958 to 1960. And that realistically was the right choice to kind of just sweep these vehicles under the rug. That said, let's talk about the 1958 to 60 Continentals and the Marks because they really represent some very unique automobiles in a number of ways. And they are, at least in my mind, beautiful and certainly are well-built vehicles. Let's start out with a fact that many people don't know about these, and that is that these vehicles are unibody cars. They're not body-on-frame. And that is quite an accomplishment when you consider that this vehicle is absolutely huge. You're staring at a vehicle with 131 inches in wheelbase and 229 inches in overall length. Let's just put that in the context of the size of competitive vehicles for the 1958 model year when it was introduced. As I mentioned, the Lincoln had a 131-inch wheelbase and 229 inches in overall length. And for the introductory year in 1958, the Cadillac rode atop 129.5-inch wheelbase and was just 216.8 inches in overall length. So it's about a foot shorter than the Lincoln. The Imperial in 1958 rode atop 129-inch wheelbase and was 225.8 inches in overall length. So it was about 3 inches shorter than the Lincoln. And in that 1958 model year, the Lincoln came equipped with a 430 cubic inch V8, making 375 horsepower, the MEL V8, or Mercury Edsel Lincoln. The Cadillac had a much smaller V8, 365 cubic inches, making just 310 horsepower. And Imperial had the last year of the Hemi V8 underhood, 392 cubic inch Hemi, making 345 horsepower. So not only was the Lincoln bigger in 1958, the year that it was introduced, it also had larger engines. For 1959, the engines would change in both Cadillac and Imperial, but interestingly, neither would top the Lincoln in size. Cadillac went from a 365 cubic incher underhood to its 390 cubic incher, which made 325 horsepower, still 50 short of the original 58 Lincoln and 25 short of the 350 horsepower in the 1959 Lincoln. Imperial now went to a wedge V8, the 413, which made 350 horsepower on par with the Lincoln. But it obviously still was smaller at 413 cubic inches compared to 430 cubic inches. Now, as I said, the Lincoln was a unibody vehicle and one of the largest unibodies that was ever produced, only topped by the 1973 Imperial, which was a bit longer overall. But still, this was absolutely huge. And part of the reason for that was that these Lincolns were produced at the same plant in Wixom, Michigan, that produced the Thunderbird, which was a unibody vehicle. So despite numerous engineers having reservations that this huge Lincoln would be a unibody vehicle, Chief Engineer Earl McPherson said it was going to be unibody, and there was no debate about that. He certainly won that battle, but he may have lost the war, as part of the reason that a number of companies went to unibodies because they were lighter than the body on frame. But in fact, this Lincoln, when it came out, weighed over 4,700 pounds. It was actually about 300 more pounds than its 1957 counterpart. And part of that was because Lincoln had to keep adding bracing to the unibody because of issues that resulted from the builds. In fact, it was alleged that Lincoln actually procured a Nash Ambassador which was similarly unibody, to determine how American Motors effectively constructed these unibodies. But regardless, Lincoln had a number of structural rigidity problems until they kept adding more and more and more bracing and weight to the overall unibody, and the result was what I mentioned before. On top of that, it seems that the unibody endowed these Lincolns with a less than ideal ride in some respects. While the handling was generally praised, particularly for the size of the vehicle when the cars were introduced, Lincoln did make mention that they added enhanced sound deadening for the 1960 model year to help quell some road vibrations and overall noise in the cabin, which is part of the effect of these, well, let's call them more ancient unibodies versus the modern unibody vehicles that are produced today. That said, it would be hard to argue that these Lincolns from 58 to 60 are, well, anything but imposing, shall we say. They certainly have a presence associated with them. Although the 1959 that you see here was a toned-down version of the 1958 model, which had much more sculptural body sides. Here you can see the 59 in the main picture compared to the 58 in the inset. And notice the 59, the forms just are more muted and toned down versus the previous model years. Now, aside from the super cool rear end treatment here, which was a bit modified versus the 1958s, you'll notice that the Continental Mark IV shown here has a dropping rear window where that center portion of the rear window actually drops all the way, and you get some awesome flow-through ventilation as a result. Now, these weren't the first vehicles to have that kind of dropping backlight in them. At least there were some other concept cars like the Packard Predictor from 1956 that also had a dropping rear window. In fact, one might argue that the rear of this Continental looks pretty similar to that Packard Predictor rear, although it obviously doesn't have the vertical tail lamps or the sculpture on the deck lid. But it does have some similar look, and certainly the roof with that overhang over top of the rear window is common. Now, Packard had featured that type of a rear window on the Packard Balboa concept in 1953, but certainly the Predictor roofline is much more reminiscent of this Lincoln roofline. In addition to that cool roofline out back, you did get some goodies depending upon the equipment that you got in your Lincoln. Notice here that this particular vehicle has the directed power differential. If you ordered that, then you got this badge on the back over top of the fuel filler door. I don't think I've ever seen another car that advertised the directed power or positive traction rear end quite like these Lincolns did, but kind of a cool feature. Of course, with that enormous sized vehicle, you did get an enormous trunk in these Lincolns. As you can see here, this one's missing the so-called hat box topper for the spare tire that's normally found here. And the trunk trim, I think, is, well, rather strange, but it is what it is. This is the factory trunk trim on these vehicles. Now, another interesting thing about the trunks on these Lincolns is that they are large, but notice that the trunk isn't open very far in this particular photo, and that's because the trunk lid really doesn't rotate all that far into a vertical position on these cars for whatever reason. It's kind of a relatively small opening for a very large trunk, but that's how they all are, and it's one of those strange features of these Lincolns that I guess owners, well, had to deal with. I don't know that I would be overly happy because you can't really reach in all that easily to the trunk without bopping your head on the deck lid. On the inside, you did get a pretty sweet interior in these 59 Continentals, and I particularly love the dashboard on these. You can see it just has this beautiful mid-century modern feel to it. You did get the temperature gauge, a fuel gauge, a clock, and then off to the left, you see the HVAC control. Everything is controlled with one knob and through that one dial. You notice this is an air-conditioned car, so there's a heater position, a de-icing position, an air conditioning position, and a ventilation position. It's all controlled within that dial, which you rotate a little index pointer around, and then to control the fan speed, you pull out the control on the dash. So every single thing associated with the HVAC is controlled through one control. I don't think I've seen another car with that. It kind of works. It's not ideal, but it is quirky and kind of cool. You'll also notice that this vehicle has a split in the glass that is glass actually in front of the speedometer, and it's cracked at the 55 mile an hour marker. For whatever reason, all of these cars have cracked glass at that 55-mile-an-hour point. It's not random. It's always at that point. It must be a point of unnatural stress. I believe that Lincoln even recalled the cars to try to fix it, but obviously the ones that survive may or may not have had the fix, or the glass may have just cracked again. Here's a close-up of the same HVAC control on a non-air conditioned car. You can see that lower left quadrant is missing any options to select from because this car does not have air conditioning. And then notice the little knobs underneath it, one for the wipers, which, by the way, I believe were still vacuum on these Lincolns, one for the air system. So that is the controller for the HVAC. You turn it right, left to select the appropriate position, then you'd pull it out to start the fan going. And then obviously the light switch there to the right of the air system switch. And as you pull back a little farther, you can see this particular car, as well as the previous one I was showing, are equipped with the automatic headlamp dimming, the Autotronic eye up there at the top of the instrument panel. So that would effectively sense oncoming traffic and then automatically dim your headlamps as appropriate. I do like the steering wheel in this 1959 Lincoln as well. It's kind of a handsome overall design, four-spoke design. And then let's take a look at the right portion of the instrument panel here for some additional features regarding the radio. And here you can see it, the radio has a town and a country setting. So if you push the town button, then the radio is going to have less reception, and it's only going to pick up relatively close stations. If you push the country button, it'll pick stations that are located further away. You also see the temperature gauge, the ammeter, the clock, and the various warning lights on here. Now, one thing I will say about the shift quadrant and the shifting on these for the automatic transmission is kind of interesting as well. There's a D2 as well as a D1 position. If you put the vehicle in D2, it starts out in second gear. So if you want the car to start in first gear, or the Cruise-O-Matic that is, to start in first gear, you have to make sure that the shift quadrant is in the D1 position. And speaking of what's under hood and the driveline, here's a picture of the 430 cubic inch V8 under hood in one of the Lincolns that I previously showed, and this one has air conditioning. Notice that when you got air conditioning on these vehicles, you actually got two evaporators, one in either fender. As you can see there, notice the air conditioning hoses are running both the driver's side as well as the passenger side fender. I don't know of any other domestic vehicle that had dual evaporators like this. And the air conditioning is consequently quite cold, although this is the Ford kind of Tecumseh York two-piston compressor underhood that it was effective, although I will say that GM's air conditioning, I think, was even better during this time frame. Also notice that the hood latches are on the firewall there as opposed to the front of the vehicle. This hood opens in a reverse manner. That was done allegedly for safety reasons. You have to unhook the hood from inside, then walk over to the passenger side to unlatch it. Kind of a goofy setup, but that's what Lincoln had at the time. You can see the fuel pump there that's up near the radiator in the fan stream to help cool it and minimize vapor lock. And from the driver's side here, you'll notice that this owner has converted the brake system to have a dual chamber master cylinder. This one would have had from the factory just a single chamber master cylinder and a treadle vac setup, as it was called. It looks like this owner has converted it to a more conventional setup, which makes a heck of a lot of sense because I'm sure that parts for that treadle vac setup are now about impossible to come by. Another interesting thing about this vehicle, and you're not going to be able to see it in this photo, but if you're looking at the vehicle and you're trying to find the power steering pump on these, you're not going to find it all that readily, and that's because it's driven off the front end of the crankshaft. And that was a setup that Lincoln would continue all the way through the 1969 model year, even on the 460 V8 that came in the Continental Mark III at that time frame. It worked. I have that setup in my 69 Mark III. It works just fine, although I do kind of worry about, well, what happens if this springs a leak and can anybody fix it? I think they can, but it's at least a little bit more worrisome to me than just a regular old power steering pump that unbolts and you can put a new one or a rebuilt one on. And there you have it, the story of one of the most massive automobiles ever produced, one of the most massive unibody cars ever produced, and certainly one that is misunderstood in many ways, not necessarily appreciated all that much, and as a consequence, I think kind of unloved. Many people, when you think of Lincolns, think of the 1961 Continental, which is certainly a beautiful vehicle and deserving of praise. But I do think these 58 to 60 Lincolns deserve a bit more praise than what they get. They're kind of still panned all these years later, but you have to respect a vehicle that was almost 230 inches long, handled relatively well. In the 1958 model year, had 375 horsepower, went 0 to 60 in about 9 seconds or a little bit under, moving all that weight that quickly. And it transported its passengers in great luxury and comfort with top-of-the-line materials and top-of-the-line build quality. It certainly had its flaws, but these Lincolns are, I think, some of the best ones that Lincoln ever produced, and certainly some of the most unique. But what do you think? Drop me a comment in the comment section. Till next time, thanks again for watching.